the meaning and watched the talking hands.
She writes in a beautifully accessible way. She pulls you in with the human story, and she wears her learning very lightly, so all those details then just come through very naturally in the writing. So for that reason, she almost has to be popular, because how can you resist a good story well told, particularly when there are all these extraordinary revelations about the past?
Ancient Greece was so removed from us today that it's very hard to create anything that would be readable, I think, that was absolutely true to its time. What Mary Renault has managed to do, both with the psychology of what she writes and with her dialogue, is to create that sense of a fusion between the mores of now and then.
I was terribly impressed by the cleanness and the simplicity of the language. I know Mary at one point said that she was asked how she had chosen the voice in which she was going to write these books, whether they were narrated by somebody or they were told in the third person. And she said she couldn't choose an ancient Greek voice because ancient Greek is polysyllabic, and modern polysyllabic English sounds like government speak. So she couldn't write like that. So she chose, I think, a marvellous route, which was to write plainly but evocatively.
She would take a classical passage, say from Plato or Xenophon, and she'd rewrite it completely. You could, if you knew the passage, just see where she'd got it from. I think there's a passage where the fleet leaves for Salamis.
Siwn cataber de kai ho alos homelos hapas hos epen, ho ente pole kai aston kai xenon. Hoimen epichorioi to svetrus.
The sails filled. The oar blades all together beat up and down, bright feathered wings. Like swans, the ships flew singing towards the island. Tears stung my eyes. I wept for the beauty of it like many more. Happy for the Athenians if the tears that followed afterwards had been like mine.
She completely redoes it and makes it so much more dramatic and real and personal. Now that's a great, great art.
And the other thing that she does immensely well, I think, is her dialogue. Because dialogue is also, as a historical writer, nobody speaks in ancient prose, everybody speaks in whatever is their modern idiom. But for me, the historical writers who write historical fiction in modern idiom are scarily bad and almost unreadable. But she couldn't write in ancient Greek, we wouldn't understand it. So what she does is to create a sense of dialogue which gives that sense of ancientness without resorting to cod medieval English.
Quietly, insistently, without touching him, Hephaestion said, "You're with me now. I promised you I'd be here. Listen, Alexander, think of Achilles, how his mother dipped him in the Styx. Think how black and terrible, like dying, like being turned to stone. But then he was invulnerable. Look, it's finished, it's over now. Now you're with me."
No aspect of ancient Greek society was left out of her vision, including its inclusive approach to sexual relationships.
The novels are very interested in what is still known as Greek love, which again has been a hugely important theme in English literature, really going all the way back to Byron, Shelley, for whom the Mediterranean and Greece, they're both beautiful, but they're also playgrounds in which you can explore erotic fantasy, erotic relationships in a way that you can't in puritanical, tight, rain-swept Christian England.
This was another challenge for the classics establishment. Their idealizations of ancient Greece had tiptoed around the love that dare not speak its name, whether it was Achilles and Patroclus or whatever Sappho got up to on Lesbos.
I remember being amazed by her expression of this very fluid sexuality where men could love men, where women could love women, where men could love women and men. And it's something which is very subtly portrayed within the stories. I mean, it's, you know, you're certainly not kind of hit over the head with a hammer of this is going to be a story about confused and complicated and liberated sexuality. And yet you pick up from that. And I think that's really helped me in my understanding of the past, because this is what it was like.
If you want to write about that era, and you want to write about the people who were great and the people who achieved, you have to write about the men, because the women weren't allowed to achieve anything. And if you're going to write about the men, the overwhelming majority of them were at the very least bisexual.
Oh, well, I think a lot of people are intermediately sexed, you know. You know, there is a whole lot, it's like something shading from white to black and all sorts of greys in the middle.
She wrote beautifully about boys, and especially boys with boys. She loved the culture of boys, I think, and having herself been, well, I don't know what they called it in those days, you know, her gay, they call it now, lesbian, and she didn't like that word. But she had a companion all her life, and whatever it was, she understood men better than women. She said that herself. And she liked the men. She wanted to be a man in some way.
There's also that little added quirk that lesbian women do find gay men fascinating. And I don't know why, but if you get them to talk honestly, they do. There's something about polar opposites being interesting, about trying to understand what it is that is so completely other.
I think I was trying to get across the message that homosexuals in Greece were exposed to social standards. You know, there were people like other people, and most of them were bisexual anyway.
It's the thing the Greeks take for granted, and once you start from that aspect, you know, and you've got a first-person narrator who also takes it for granted, you just sort of go into it like you would about the way they dined or shopped or fought or any of the other things they did.
So convincing was her recreation of this male-dominated world that some early reviewers assumed she was a man, writing under a pseudonym. They were half right. Her real name was Mary Challens, born in 1905 to an East London doctor.
It was a very respectable artisan quarter. It was all street after street, you know, with little semi-detached houses, and each house had a bay window with a painted pot and an aspidistra in the pot. And then in the little front garden, which was a few yards square, would be a privet hedge, and outside the privet hedge there were cast iron railings. And I know, you know, that we had those real London fogs in those days, and there was one, my father said he could hardly see his hand in front of his face, and he was out on his rounds. And he said he knew where he was by feeling the railings and feeling the pattern on them, and he knew which street he was in, found his way home like that.
Mary was a lonely child. She grew up in a family in which her relationship with both her mother and her father was quite strained. The parents were not happy. She was aware of constant arguments and long silences. The oldest child, she was the brainy one. She was the one who read. She was the one who retreated to the loft over the garage at the back and lost herself for hours in books.
Well, when I was little, I thought I would be a cowboy. But when my mother explained to me that if I went out to a ranch, I'd have to darn the socks and cook, I changed my mind about that. I always wanted to be a writer, but of course it took me a long time to realize that you could actually be paid for writing.
And there was an old stable at the back, and there was a little loft up on top of this, and I had a very nice little nest up there. And I had this notebook, which I think was just one of the, something like a grocer's order book, and I started this Western in it, but it didn't get very far. Very large writing over about 8 pages.
Renault did not like to fuss. It was only years later that she acknowledged some of the consequences of her childhood in correspondence with the writer and painter Colin Spencer, whom she met in Greece in the 1960s.
There's one particular story I remember, which is that throughout her childhood, her parents were always quarrelling behind closed doors. And so that when she grew up, she always had doors in the house open. She could not bear them closed because she feared what was behind them. And this was something she only recently realized, her obsessive interest in having doors open.
After the First World War, a sympathetic godmother suggested that boarding school might open some doors for Mary. She was packed off to Clifton School for Girls in Bristol.
By the time she was a senior girl, she had the option of using the library on her own, and that's where she first read Plato. In retrospect, she was to see it herself as a pivotal moment in defining who she was. It became a kind of touchstone for her. The notion of the dialogue, the notion of the exploring in all sorts of ways of very difficult emotional and moral issues.
Anyone bright enough to teach themselves Plato, even in translation, was university material. Renault went up to St Hugh's College, Oxford in 1925 to read English. Among her teachers was the young J.R.R. Tolkien. It might have been the moment where the world lost a scholar but gained a storyteller. At any rate, she spent far too much time writing and performing in college plays, ending up with a third-class degree. But Oxford was not finished with her yet. Her 20s were a desperate period. Still trying to write, but with barely any income, she became seriously ill from malnutrition. Convalescing, she found herself revisiting her old haunts among the dreaming spires. In front of the famous Radcliffe Infirmary, she abruptly decided to become a nurse.
Her decision to nurse is not one that she's ever really explained. It was certainly a very, very radical act for someone from her background.
We just didn't have the money to make me a doctor. But I didn't feel frustrated about this. I don't think I ever really wanted to be a doctor. You see, I always wanted to be a writer. But meanwhile, I had to earn my living.
It was a job for working class girls, for the most part, working class girls with aspirations. But it was a huge commitment. One wore white, one wore a very large hat, one lived in hospital, in a cell. One was only allowed to have 7 personal possessions. She always wondered if each book counted as one of those personal possessions. And one was called sister, as if one were a nun. She wanted to write about real life. She needed to get to know something very corporeally real. And what she got to know, of course, was bodies and hard work. And, of course, she met Julie.
Julie Mullard, just 21 when they met, was another trainee nurse. The relationship was to last the rest of their lives. One man who knew them both at the time was a neurologist, Jim McGregor, father of the broadcaster Sue McGregor, who later got to know Renault well.
They clicked somehow. He found that Mary and Julie were interesting people, very intelligent. They had things in common. They read the same books. They also had a great sense of fun, and there were lots of parties after hours. And Mary and Julie, rather than being the starched nurses, I think, that most young doctors are rather frightened of, were actually sympathetic shoulders if things were going wrong, on which to cry.
Julie was the great contrast because she was eupeptic. I mean, absolutely very alive, very garrulous, but also very protective. She was almost the framework around Mary.
Mary's relationship with Julie blew them both away. It was terribly romantic, extraordinarily sexual, wonderfully liberating for both of them. I don't think Mary had had a serious boyfriend before this time. Julie had, but both of them were virginal, and this was an explosion.
But I suppose a fairly fundamental thing is that both people should agree on what a friendship should be like, or what they want out of it anyway. And I think another thing is we laugh at the same thing.
Yes, it just happened.
Yes.
No, we didn't work anything out, you know. We just liked each other best, I suppose.
Shortly before war began again in 1939, Renault finally published her first novel. Purposes of Love was a doctor's and nurse's story with a discreet bisexual twist. Wartime put hospitals more than ever in the public eye, and the book sold well under her new name, taken to conceal her identity from the hospital authorities. Finding time to write during the war was hard, but by 1948 there were 4 more novels on similar themes. One of them, Return to Night, won a lucrative prize in America, and for Mary and Julie, it was their ticket out.
Well, I think it was claustrophobia. I mean, there was an enormous exodus from Britain just after the war. It was a sort of terribly grey kind of aftermath. And everybody who could possibly get out into the sun, after not being able even to go to the seaside, you know, for years and years, everybody went.
Oh, it was over breakfast one Sunday morning.
We were reading The Observer.
That's right.
And we suddenly realised that after the Germans, the next thing was going to be the Russians, and we were absolutely fed up. You know, one thought one had got rid of all that.
Mary said, what about going to South Africa? And I put down the other, maybe the Times, you had The Observer. I said, South Africa? Oh, South Africa, yes. Yes, all right, why not?
Well, it was quite different at that time, especially in Natal. A lot of people pitched up there from England. And it was really rather fun. I won't say it was like Kenya must have been in its heyday, but it was rather that feeling, you know. It was all very sort of happy-go-lucky and gay and party-ish. And it took one a long, long time to really settle down to the politics of the country.
There were 2 Marys. There was the serious scholar. There was the Mary who spent years getting her research right. And then, on the other hand, when she relaxed and gave her